advantages even beyond just the glabellar lines. Um, um, that precision seems to offer advantages even beyond just the glabellar lines. How do you sort of convey that message, even though you only are indicated for glabellar lines? And really, what does that precision enable a clinician to do? And does that affect your original thinking about getting additional indications added to the label?
Sure. Let me take one part of it and then hand over to Rui to give you a clinical point of view on it. Let me just start with every neurotoxin in this market has a unique personality. And what makes Jeuveau unique is a precision profile of the product. What we hear from injectors is that it enables them to do things with Jeuveau that they weren't able to do with other neurotoxins before. Understanding how to push precision to deliver a different level of outcome is really what could differentiate Jeuveau over time. And I'll let Rui talk a little bit about the extra strength study that he designed. And part of the confidence was driven by the position of the product as you push the dose, because that's always a concern that injectors have as you move dose up, that you may get more spread of a toxin. And so Rui, I'll turn it over to you to provide more thoughts.
Sure. So just to build on the first part David had. So when, as a clinician, you put, a toxin in your hand, just like David said, every toxin has a different profile. And people like the different toxins for the profile that they have. The one thing that we did recognize, as you're mentioning, is this seems to be a very precise drug and a lot of precision. What that means for the clinicians is, from a confidence perspective, they feel confident going to structures where they were a little bit more cautious. Spread is a really big deal. If you look at the FDA and you look at their concerns, they've got a whole page on local and distant spread, all the adverse events that you have to look at. So when you reduce that down to practice, glabellar lines, like you said, that's a relatively easy indication. When you start going into areas like the DAO, kind of the depressor of the angle of the mouth, you want to have a very precise drug as an example, because if you actually spread or have an issue with that, you can then start taking out the depressors of labii. So now you've got a whole bunch of complications. Even things up around the lateral canthus, there's a zygomatic muscle that comes down. And so if you knock that out, then you're starting to have trouble with smiles. So basically, what it does is it really helps enable kind of precise deployment of the toxin and give docs confidence. On your question of label and how do we train, it's a really good question. And obviously, we're always evaluating whether or not we want to invest in expanding the label. Where we are today is we recognize that we really needed to invest in having the right profile within our organization to be able to dialogue with healthcare professionals. And our medical affairs group is really differentiated from most pharma companies or biotech companies. Instead of medical science liaisons, they're actually clinicians. So they're medical affairs clinicians. So a rep would be able to talk about something on label if we had a label expansion, but a medical affairs clinician can speak in a compliant way and respond to these unsolicited questions when they ask about how to do an Nefertiti's lip, how do you do the DAO, how do you inject these different parts? And they're highly credentialed because these medical affairs clinicians actually inject product, and so they have experience. So even just the degree of credibility that they have when they talk to clinicians, we found this being really helpful. And of course, we invest in other things like CME events and additional training parts. And then I guess I think I got most of the elements of your question. And then just to kind of hit on what David said, that's right, the extra strength. This is why we were pretty confident going into the extra strength. If you're going to go to a bigger dose, we really need to be cognizant of the spread. So we thought that profile worked really well for long duration.
And so, Rui, maybe just as a follow-up to that comment, because obviously the big advantage of getting additional indications onto the label is the sales rep can talk about it. But I guess, tell me if I'm reading into it the right way, that so many of these physicians or injectors themselves, they have a sense of how they want to use a toxin. And so they're going to hear your message broadly around precision and simply ask your clinicians or injectors, your medical staff on their own, right? Like they don't need to be sort of pushed towards it. It's almost a pull model, if you will. Maybe I'm getting thinking about it the wrong way, using the wrong phrase, but
you're absolutely right. I mean, if we think about healthcare professionals and toxins as a space, over 90%, probably over 95% of the toxins are used off label. Because even when you inject glabellar lines lateral canthus, you don't necessarily, or forehead in particular, you never inject it on label. So even there, where it's quote unquote on label, it's actually off label. Second fact, most of these folks go to symposiums, they attend conferences, docs get on, they talk on the podium, and they literally talk about how to use and how they use the product off label. So you're absolutely right. There's lots of dialogue and training. And so if you were to think about a rep talking about off label, about a new expanded label, it'd be very limited in terms of what they could say, and they'd be very limited in terms of the credentials about talking about it. Instead, we've invested pretty heavily right now in medical affairs clinicians who, like I mentioned, because they actually inject, when they get asked in an unsolicited form about how to inject in different areas, the credibility that comes from somebody who actually injects corresponding with a colleague or somebody who actually injects is just much higher. And you can get into a lot more detail that a rep, quite frankly, couldn't get into.
And one of the interesting things, Rui, you recently released data, I think it was a couple days ago, around a study in male patients, which showed a 10% higher response rate for Jeuveau than Botox. And this is interesting to me because it's consistent with the data we've seen in the past, although maybe not quite to the same degree. Certainly, it's something that I have heard anecdotally, but again, it's sort of traditionally been, or it's hard to quantify. I'm just curious, is this something that you're broadly hearing from customers in the real world? And what do you attribute it to? And is there a way for you to capitalize on that, or commercially?
Sure. So let me try and give a little background, then kind of go a little forward. So you're absolutely right. When we published our head-to-head study, we actually published every single one of the data points, and there were 30 of them. And if you look at them one by one and select whichever one you want to prioritize, the interesting thing was 26 out of those 30 endpoints, global 1-point improvement by scale, GIS, subject satisfaction, whatever you wanted. 26 out of those 30, the Jeuveau seemed to do a little bit better than the Botox. When we went into the male, the actual difference was actually higher. We saw more differentiation. That 10% value is kind of on average. If you actually go through and look at every single one of those data points, again, there are 30 endpoints there, and you can prioritize as you wish. What you see is actually more delta, more in favor of Jeuveau versus Botox. And they're actually 28 out of the 30 or higher. If you look at day 1, the responder rates for Jeuveau is about 52% by day 2, whereas Botox coming out about 35. And if you go right to the end of the study at day 150, we're still at 40% responders at the end of the study, and Botox is at 19%. The relevance of the males is historically they are poorer responders than females. And so why most people think that it's because there's more mass, muscle mass. So if you think about it that lens, this a comparison head-to-head is almost like a potency test. It's almost like an assay to see which is more potent. And if you believe the data, it's a small study, we tend to have more responders and a bigger delta response to male. So maybe it seems to substantiate the point that it seems to be a little bit more potent. Now, how do you use it? Right now, it's certainly head-to-head data. It's consistent with everything that we've seen. So it's nice to see consistency. It's really nice to see that fast onset. It's really nice to see duration at 5 months. And opportunistically, any healthcare professionals who are treating males, it's a really nice piece of literature to have, especially in an area where there's very little. We can only find one paper where there's actually comparative studies in males. And David, I don't know if you want to add anything to what I just said.
I think you covered it. Thank you, Ruth.
And you did touch on it already a little bit about the in terms of precision. I'm just curious. I wanted to hear a little bit more about how you're thinking about the extra strength and how that would just you expect it to compete with Revance and Daxi, which seems to be where their message is going to only or largely be focused on the duration element of it, and you're going to have both your sort of regular strength version as well as the extra strength. And I think it's always helpful for people to understand how you think or view sort of an extra strength and a longer duration product fitting into this market.
Sure. I'll start with a compliment to our competitor. We as an organization came into a space that we all recognize is really underpenetrated, and our focus was to build a millennial group and then take advantage of that. And I think they've done a really nice job continue to expand the market, and all boats rise with that tide, and they created this new sector that people are referring to as a longer duration. So good for them. We've watched this space, and we always felt that was more kind of I'm going to use the word niche, and if I look at it, if you ask a healthcare professional, do you want a longer duration, 86% of them said yes. If you ask them, okay, so let's break down a day, which product would you use the most during the day, that longer duration or the original strength? The majority say, I want the optionality to have the longer duration, but most of the day I'm going to use original strength. So, and that's been very consistently what we've heard. So I think, Revance did a nice job of building that extra strength duration, and we want to be able to participate in that also. So now if I think about where the metrics are, where the lines are, if we look at the Belmont data and the Sakura data, we're seeing about 23.5 weeks to 24 weeks duration when we look at a 1-point improvement, just so that we could talk apples to apples. When we look at our data, our phase 3 data, we're 21 weeks. So it's about 2.5 to 3 weeks difference. And then, a couple considerations. One, Daxi, they doubled the dose. And then the other really important consideration that everyone has to remember is most of our patients were difficult. Most of them had severe wrinkles, whereas in the Daxi, most of their patients were moderate. So they did easier patients. So there are differences, and there's about 2.5, maybe 3 weeks difference. So we came in with the extra strength study, and where we toggled two variables. We doubled the dose and we made it hyper concentrated. And knowing that we have very precise profile, we thought that may be a pretty good advantage too. So at the end of the day, we've set this up as a phase 2 study so that we could take it complete to the label. And I think, you know, if in fact this longer duration takes life onto its own, then we have a value proposition where we can offer both an extra strength and the original strength, and then healthcare professionals to do it. In other words, we wanted to be able to have the flexibility to participate in longer duration sector.
And I'm just curious, because I think it would be helpful for people to hear, when you talk to clinicians and ask them, oh, so you know, there's an interest, we would like to have an extra strength or a longer duration product, yet in the end, most of my products will still be the sort of regular strength or sort of the typical duration product of that, you know, 3 to 4+ month sort of range. I'm just curious, do they explain why they would anticipate they'll still largely be using their regular strength product?
Yeah, David, do you want to take that one?
You know, I had this conversation last night, so I'll share with you a specific example of this. A doctor I was at a dinner table with last night was commenting that in this forehead specifically, where the approved indication is 20 units with the market leader, she was making the comment that she, on average, uses 10 to 12 units on patients. So then the question is, well, why would you underdose relative to the label in the forehead area? And her comment was that you get a more natural look, that patients are coming in for a look first and the duration second. And that if she increases the dose, what you get is a more frozen effect in the forehead that creates more of an unnatural, undesired look. And what's interesting is when we look at the forehead, that's the case around the country. They underdose the forehead relative to the labeled dose. So what you're going to find is that when products enter the market, not only can you not double the dose in certain areas, you're going to have to do something completely different altogether. So the idea that you're going to prioritize getting a few extra weeks over the look, I just don't think that's what this aesthetic market is built on. This is artistry first. It's about the look the consumer gets, and then it's about the benefits that follow that. Of course, safety is paramount, but we're talking about duration benefits. So I think it's a little bit trickier than a therapeutic product where you say, okay, they're all the same. It's just one lasts longer. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's more complex than that. I know you know that, but that's important for investors to understand.
Okay, and then finally, I think you made the comment at the beginning of our, of the talk about building an aesthetics platform company, which obviously hits more than just Jeuveau. So I'm just curious, maybe provide an update in terms of how you're thinking about business development and what exactly you mean or envision when you say aesthetics platform company.
Sure. So I guess it starts with when I joined and Rui was around the table, we said we have to prove this company belongs in the space by executing. And so what we did was we focused on the execution of Jeuveau in the US, gaining approval outside the US, and now executing there. We then built unique capabilities in this company. By being cash pay only, we're focused on the ability to serve this market more like a beauty company would rather than a pharma company. And with that, some of the unique capabilities we built didn't exist in the space, like co-branded media, where we're running thousands of campaigns on a quarterly basis that we do